On April 24th, 2015, Brittany Mills opened the door of her Baton Rouge apartment. There was no need for trepidation when she opened the door because the person on the other side of it was somebody she knew. After their investigation, Baton Rouge police believe the person asked Brittany to borrow her car. I'm assuming they got that info from her 8-year-old daughter, who sadly overheard the whole thing. When Brittany refused, multiple shots rang off as Brittany immediately collapsed to the floor. Trauma that her 8-year-old daughter won't ever outrun, the way the killers outrun police for a decade now. As if the situation wasn't already sad enough, Brittany was 8 months pregnant at the time of the shooting, and her son was still born via emergency surgery, but tragically passed away just about a week later. 9 years after the fact, the case is still unsolved, even after the police finally got into Brittany's encrypted phone. Now, many cases like this have been solved with the help of a modern invention, the doorbell camera. Like the video where I covered Travis Rudolph. Without the doorbell cam, his case may have had a different outcome. But the case of Brittany Mills took place in 2015. And while the doorbell cam came out a year prior, most people didn't have them at scale until a few years later, which sucks because it would have been huge in this case. Without it, police have struggled and ultimately failed to solve this case even after 10 years. But when it first happened, many people turned their gaze at one man, a one-time romantic partner of Brittany about a year before her murder. When asked about previous boyfriends, Brittany's daughter named several, but the most notable one was Lyel Collins. At the time, Lyel was a star tackle at LSU, who would have been a top 15 draft pick had he come out a year earlier. He opted to stay in school despite little to no upside, and called a level of downside even I couldn't imagine. The 2015 draft he was now going to be a part of was scheduled to take place on April 30th, but 6 days before the draft, Brittany was killed, and now Lyel's name is being brought up by Brittany's daughter. Even before NIL, it's hard to believe that a star player at LSU wouldn't have really easy access to a car. So to ask Brittany to borrow hers doesn't really make sense, but he's actually got a much stronger alibi than that. On the night of Brittany's murder, Lyel Collins was over an hour away in a whole different city. 1 week away from realizing a lifelong dream, he was in New Orleans with a group of friends and family, said to attend a Pelicans and Warriors game. Just to keep the facts clear, the game took place the following night, on April 25th, but they met up in New Orleans a day or two before the game, with the game being the centerpiece of the whole trip. On Lyel's end, he felt he was in a really good place. He's watching a game with the fam, about to get drafted. He'd grown up without his dad, who was incarcerated, but his mom, Lyel Collins, was up to the task. A highly religious woman who, along with the help of her mom, gave all 5 of her kids biblical names. Lyel actually means belonging to God, a name that Lyel felt was fitting. Now this is weird, but Miss Lyel was 29 years old when she gave birth to Lyel. It's only weird because that's the same age that Brittany Mills was when she was set to give birth to her first son. Not terribly relevant, but the type of coincidence I like to point out. Miss Lyel had done everything for her kids. She kept uncles and cousins around so they had male role models, kept them in church, kept them always occupied. That way she can keep them from falling into trouble. She worked multiple jobs, whooped them when they got out of line, and Lyel's respect and love for her couldn't be any deeper. So it's hard to imagine he'd have anything to do with taking the life of a woman who in so many ways shared a similar plight and path of his own mother, who he loved and respected dearly. Now, one day before the draft, Lyel wants nothing more than to pay her back for everything she's done. But instead he has to give her the worst news imaginable, news that would almost certainly break her spirit. Sports Illustrated captured the moment really well. Check out this excerpt from their article back in 2015. Chicago, in a cramped hotel room one day before the NFL draft. Speaking before a dozen of his relatives and close friends, Lyel Collins began to cry as he delivered the news. He wasn't walking across the stage at the Auditorium Theater, and despite the outfits they bought, his family wasn't hitting the gold carpet. He was instead flying back home to Baton Rouge, Louisiana to answer questions in a murder investigation. Lyel really took ownership and handled this in a way that, if he's indeed innocent, has to be commended. Keep in mind, at the time, he's like 21 years old, one day before the biggest day of his life. "This is on me," Lyel said. "I own this. I had nothing to do with this, but it's affecting y'all. I just feel bad that we're not gonna be able to live our dream at the draft." Now, for a couple hours before that conversation, Lyel sat in a conference room with his agents. He was crying his eyes out, repeatedly professing his innocence. "I did not do this," he said on repeat. Even during that time, he kept bringing up his family, begging his agents not to interrupt his family's experience at the draft. To do this for them obviously meant a lot to the dude. They done so much for him that he wanted to pay him back. And again, presuming that he had nothing to do with this crime, both his and his family's whole draft experience was completely ruined due to no fault of his own. At the same time, he understood what Britney's family was going through and wanted to cooperate with the police to help in any way he could. So he packed his bags, hopped on a plane, and left the draft behind to go cooperate with the police. Lyel complies fully with the investigation and offered information that his lawyers might have advised him against. He'd been involved with Britney around 1 year earlier, but given the timing of her pregnancy, it was close enough that she'd contacted him a month before the draft to inform him that he might be the father of the child. This information could be seen as a potential motive, although it would be extremely evil and a stupid ass move. We saw something similar play out in the Ray Caruth case, where this dude had his pregnant girlfriend shot to avoid child support. This was despite being a well-paid NFL player. But Lyel's character couldn't be further from Caruth's, and while Ray flipped out when this girl told him she was pregnant, Lyel had quickly agreed to take the paternity test after the kid was born to determine if it was his. If the baby was his, he planned to do the right thing and be a father to the kid like his mother would have wanted. But after the emergency delivery, a paternity test determined that the baby was not Lyel's after all. Plus, we know he couldn't have been the one who actually shot Britney, since his whereabouts that night have been accounted for. The only other option would be for him to have hired someone else, but the police said the killer was somebody she knew, which is why she opened the door in the first place, which makes the whole contract killer thing extremely unlikely. Lyel sat there and answered all of the police's questions, cooperated fully, and offered all the information that he could. He even took a lie detector test and passed with flying colors, and given the situation, there was nothing else that he could do. The police ultimately believed him. His story checked out, his alibi was airtight, and he really seemed earnest. So he left the police station, and throughout the whole process, he was never even actually named a suspect. And I say it like that because let's say you watched all the information on the case through NFL draft coverage. You probably wouldn't have known he was never named a suspect at all. Matter of fact, you probably thought he was the primary suspect, because now a guy who was said to be a top 15 pick would watch the whole first round go by without hearing his name called. Boo-hoo, right? You know? Yeah, he lost some money, but second round ain't bad. Then the second round passed. Then the third round passed. And before you knew it, Gerald Christian is getting his name called. That was 2015's Mr. Irrelevant, aka the last pick in the draft. So Lyel went from top 15 to not getting picked in 256 selections. Okay, here's what happened. NFL teams flagged Lyel's name, which they had to. They didn't know how the investigation would play out. I mean, bro, like it happened the same week of the draft. Unless he's 100% cleared, bro, you can't draft him high. So teams called his agents to say they were considering choosing Lyel like around the 5th round. But his agents understood that somebody in Lyel's situation, that was the worst case scenario. Let me explain why. Better yet, here's his agents explaining exactly why him getting picked late was worse than going undrafted. Quote, I ran the numbers. If a guy is drafted after the first round, he signs a 4-year deal. But if he gets a 3-year undrafted free agent contract and plays well, oftentimes he can get a first-round tender and the player participation pool bonus money. So within the first 4 years of his NFL career, that undrafted guy could get paid better than the 33rd pick in the draft. It was somewhat of a gamble, but given Lyel's talent and what he was projected to be, in this case, it made sense. But the media did what the media does and called his agents buffoons. Bro, they was getting flamed. But whatever, Lyel's agents issued an ultimatum. Either draft Lyel Collins in the 2nd or 3rd round, or, and hear me, don't draft him at all. On top of the contract, another thing that the media was missing was that this would allow Lyel to choose where he wanted to play, which would give him a much better chance of reaching those stipulations that the agent laid out in his explanation. Now Lyel was going through it, and he's a respectful kid, but he's having a hard time accepting the fact that his agents are wanting to go as hard as they can to accomplish him not getting drafted. You know what I'm saying? You can imagine being in his position thinking, what the hell we doing, bro? Should I fire these dudes? But boom, the agents go over the salary charts with Lyel, and at first he kind of got stuck on the fact that by now falling out of the first round due to no fault of his own, he'd already lost out on close to $20 million. Like, can you imagine somebody about to hand you 20 mil, then something happens that's extremely tragic, extremely sad, but has nothing to do with you, causes that person to snatch the money back? Eventually he works past that, looks through the salary charts, and he sees the vision his agents are trying to show him. He says, cool, first 3 rounds or don't draft me, and if you do, his agents say he'll enter next year's draft. But because he'd already hired these agents, he couldn't go back and play college football, so to sit out a year and then re-enter the draft was risky enough to derail his whole damn career. Here's the thing, bro. His agents was bluffing. They had no leverage. If somebody drafted him, he was going to training camp. But they just needed teams to buy this bluff. That way he can sign wherever he wanted after the draft. So now Lyel's draft experience is drastically different. Not only does his family not get to enjoy the festivities, but now they're all watching the draft together in the reverse mindset of where they thought they would be. Instead of waiting anxiously hoping that Lyel's name would be called, they waiting anxiously hoping and praying his name doesn't get called, because the goal now is to not get picked. After waiting so many years just to get to the point where you can hear your name called and then have to flip that switch, like, you know what I'm saying? That would feel crazy, right? In the 7th round, Lyel's agent got a text from one team who was like, forget what y'all talking about, bro. We about to draft him. We get a 1st round talent for a 7th round pick. The value is just too damn good to pass up. Lyel's agent fought him off. He was swatting them like flies. He texted him like, you're gonna embarrass yourself and waste the damn pick. It's a 7th round pick. Like, how do you waste a 7th rounder? But amazingly, the text message worked. Right after the draft, 29 of 32 teams reached out to Lyel's agents to try to sign him. His agents set up the best contract parameters they could given the situation. Let's see who's really a buyer. So his contract was non-negotiable. It wouldn't be huge, but it would be fully guaranteed with no offsets. And his 2nd and 3rd year salaries would be the max amount that an undrafted free agent was allowed to get. On top of that, he would also get all of his new team's remaining signing bonus cash pool they had left. But if he was ever charged or indicted, the guarantees would disappear, rip the contract up. So while it was the best deal Lyel could get, from the team's perspective, it was all upside. You're saving $15-16 million on a player who's a 1st round talent. It's like you getting him for free. This is on top of the fact that most of the teams believe that Lyel was truly innocent, which is important because if you believe that, you're getting a crazy discount for a player with no character concerns. But just in case you were wrong, if he does get charged, you can drop him and move on. He ultimately signed with the Cowboys for $1.7 million. A lot of bread, but nowhere near what he really should have got. But I'll say, Lyel is a different type of dude. He showed nothing but gratitude and didn't focus on what he lost. He instead focused on what he still managed to gain, and he mourned the loss of Britney and her newborn son. He played a total of 6 seasons with the Dallas Cowboys, cashing in on his 2nd contract, just like his agents had planned. He played for the Bengals 1 year and made it to the AFC Championship and signed with the Bills this past offseason. Lyel Collins suffers from a chronic back issue that slowed him down from being the player he was his first few years. But he stayed completely out of trouble, no character concerns, and I've only heard good things about him through 9 NFL seasons. Now, the most recent info I found on the Brittany Mills case was from 2018. And still no progress. At that time, police had finally gotten into her phone. This was despite Apple's refusal to unlock it. That whole process halted the investigation, and by the time they got into the phone, the case had cooled. Sadly, until this day, the case remains unsolved. Rest in peace to Brittany Mills, and that's it for this video.